Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. We are now in season 3, episode 8. I'm so excited today to have on the program Mia Brantley Wright. She is a doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina. She is also a researcher and lecturer. As a trained sociologist, Mia's academic work explores how the consequences of race impact well-being around racially marginalized communities. Additionally, Mia advocates for social change through education, empathy, and engagement. I love it. I love it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, definitely welcome. So why don't we go ahead and just start out? Can you share about how God brought you into his kingdom and just a little bit about your life?
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Mia Brantley Wright. I'm a doctoral candidate. My research largely lies at the intersection of race, gender, and family within the context of health. I was born and raised in Meridian, Mississippi, so definitely a Southern girl. And I did my undergrad at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, go Blazers. And it's also in Birmingham during my undergrad career is where, you know, I made the decision to follow Jesus, right? And so although I grew up in a family that loved God and things like that, it wasn't until my undergrad when I was really able to study the scriptures for myself and really be able to make that decision to follow Jesus. And it was also during that time where I read the Bible really for the first time and was able to see the heart of Jesus and how social justice was at the center of everything that Jesus did, and was really, really God's heart as well, right? We see that all throughout the Old Testament. And so having this kind of be my first time engaging with God and the scriptures in that way, I was like, wow, you know, I mean, I have no choice but to follow Jesus, right? Because Jesus sees me in a very different way than what I felt like the world saw me as during that time, right? So yeah, that's how I came to follow Jesus and become a Christian.
It must have been historic to be in Birmingham too.
Yeah. I mean, Birmingham, contrary to popular belief, right? Birmingham is actually pretty progressive. And it was a really great experience being there, and it's a place I would love to live again. I love Birmingham, definitely has a piece of my heart. But yeah, Birmingham, the South, of course, but Birmingham specifically has a lot of history, very rich history. I always kind of joke that, like, you know, I was born and raised in Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi. I did my undergrad in a pretty good chunk of my life, right, or at least some formative years of my life in Birmingham, and now I'm in Columbia, South Carolina. And so I'm like, you know, with my research and where God has brought me as far as engaging in different community efforts and community work, I'm always like, oh, for such a time as this, right? Like I'm always thinking like, okay, God, you had me on this path for a very specific reason. And I think it's becoming more and more clear as time goes on. So yeah, definitely a lot of rich history throughout the South for sure.
That's awesome. So I know you're obviously a doctoral candidate in sociology. So what inspired you to get into sociology? And can you also explain a little bit about what is sociology?
Yeah, for sure. So sociology, just kind of broadly, right, is just the scientific study of society, right?
Okay.
So all these different parts of society, that is what sociologists study. And there's a lot of different types of sociology, right? So you have sociologists that really look to understand interactions between people, right? More so at the micro level, like individual level. But you also have where sociologists also look to highlight how the larger social world is influencing not just individuals, but groups as well within society. And that's more of where my work lies. So you already kind of talked about it a little bit, but just to use myself as an example. So my research broadly examines two things, right? So one, my research examines the impact of racism on mothering and motherhood, as well as how stress that is produced from racism, right, is transmitted between generations. But then I also examine more broadly parent-child relationships and health within Black families, right? So I'm looking at how these large-scale social forces, so like race, racism, gender, are impacting health and impacting the well-being among families, right? So that's kind of the large-scale sociological studies. And so my current work, right, my dissertation work is looking at how children's experiences of racism impacts Black maternal health, right? And so in the social sciences, particularly in sociology, right, we've done a lot of work to understand how racism impacts health. There's a lot of work out there on it, right? And we know that, you know, racism impacts health in these kind of direct ways where, you know, once you experience it directly, your stress levels go up. It's kind of like you're in a continual fight or flight mode. So something that you'll see physical health wise would be like higher blood pressure, right? And there's also work that's starting to really look at the long-term effects of that over the life course. So experiencing that multiple times throughout your life, what that tends to do. But we also know that there are more institutionalized ways that racism is embedded that impacts health, like within the healthcare system, just historically how that was brought about. A lot of, and I won't go, I can go on tangents, but so I won't go too deep into it, but just, you know, the history of experimentation on enslaved Black people, right? Particularly Black women, and when it comes to obstetrics and gynecology, right? A lot of that work, a lot of this foundational work in that area was done through experimentation on Black women, right? Black enslaved women, right? And so there's a long history of this embedded racism within healthcare that we also see play out in Black women's health. But like I said, I won't go too deep into that, but these are just some of the ways that sociology has seen racism impacting health over time, right? But we also know that even when it's not direct, right? So if someone close to me experiences racism, it also is going to impact me, right? In some way.
Like secondhand in a way.
Exactly. And we've seen work starting to emerge from that, right? We call that the theory of linked lies. It's a perspective about life course, right? But we haven't really examined what that looks like within families, right? Particularly Black families. There's not a lot of work on that. And so that's where my dissertation and my work comes in, trying to really examine, well, what does this look like for parents and children, right? Especially we think about, particularly when we think about the summer of 2020, right? And we think about all of this happened surrounding George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and specifically, I can remember Breonna Taylor's mother doing a press conference, and I just remember seeing her and how she was able to speak and compose herself while also not like, and just in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, she can't even mourn her daughter because she's still having to work, right? She's still having to do things and to, you know, essentially lead or partially lead a movement in a sense, right? And so that kind of led me to thinking, or that was just one of the many things that kind of led me to think, wow, like nobody's really doing this work on what this is like. Like I'm sure you've heard of the Mothers of the Movement, right? But like thinking about these Black women whose children have been lost to some sort of violence. It's not always racial violence, but a lot of the times it is. So like we think about Trayvon Martin's mom, Sabrina Fulton, Tamir Rice's mom, Rekia Boyd's mom, all of these young men and women, these boys and girls, right, who who's had their lives taken, these mothers come together and they're fighting for these social changes, right? And so I'm like, wow, what does it look like, and how does it work, right? Where these children are experiencing racism, and those are more extreme experiences, of course, right? Because they lost their lives, but even these everyday occurrences that we may experience, these microaggressions, all of those types of things, how does that impact Black mothers, right? Who are a lot of the times or just Black families in general, but my work is looking at Black mothers specifically. So how's that impacting them? So that's just one example of the kind of work that I do as a sociologist, right? But just once again, kind of bringing it back, sociologists, we're just broadly looking at and trying to shed light on how these different social structures, social forces like race, like class, gender, and also just different social institutions, how they all impact us, impact our life chances, impact our experiences.
Oh yeah, this year, didn't I think I heard like this year that the life expectancy went down 3 years for African Americans.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that, but I'm gonna have to look into that because I
Yeah,
know.
I think it was the first 6 months of, I guess, based on the last 6 months of last year, they've done the review, I guess, and they're saying that it went down a year for like the United States, but for African Americans, it went down 3 years. I guess like even when you think about like COVID-19, I know it's been disparately impacting African Americans. So is that something that I guess is a sociological thing in terms of like culture, the way that that's been impacting them as far as
Yeah,
health?
I wouldn't say culture, but it's definitely sociological, right? So we can, so we're gonna take a minute and we're gonna use our sociological imagination, right? So it's not, I think a lot of the times when we hear those headlines or we read those headlines, we hear those news stories and you hear, Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately impacted by COVID. I think a lot of people can immediately go to genetics, right? Or like biology. So there's something going on with Black and Hispanic people that are making them more susceptible to COVID, which is not the case, right? There's no evidence that it's biology, right? But what we do know is when it comes to essential workers, Black and brown people are disproportionately going to be working service jobs. They're going to be disproportionately working in spaces like as nursing assistants, these different jobs where they do not have the ability to take off or work from home. So if you have more Black and Hispanic people in these positions, then they're going to be disproportionately impacted by this disease, right? And there's a really good paper that came out, I believe it was earlier this year. It's only February, so I keep thinking that it's, or in March. I keep thinking all my days are going together. But so it came out earlier this year that talked about that, right? And was shedding light on the fact that once you take into account people's people going to hospitals and people being diagnosed, there was no real difference, right, in like people getting sick and recovering by race, right? So it's not that there's something biological going on with one racial group versus another, but what they were finding was when you take into account occupation, when you take into account neighborhood, these different social phenomena, right, these social structures and social forces, that is where they were seeing the kind of disproportionate results, right? So once again, just thinking about how it's not always biology or things like that. A lot of the times it's these larger social things that are going on, which is really what led me to sociology. It's so funny, all my life, I really wanted to go into healthcare, the health field, because I've always been interested in some way, shape, or form in racial health disparities, right? So just seeing, friends and family around me growing up and seeing people get sick and seeing people who look like me get sick a lot of the times. And I'm kind of thinking like, well, what's going on within the community, And so as I got to college and I'm learning, like especially within my sociology classes, I'm like, okay, race is not biological. We know this. Science has proven this over time. And so if we know that race is not biological, then what, again, is making Black people sicker in a lot of these areas, right? Or having a lower mortality rate, right? So, or higher mortality rate, excuse me, where they're dying earlier than white folks. It's like, okay, well, what's going on here that is happening? And so the more I went on in my studies, the more I'm learning about how all of these different social forces are really influencing us once in our life chances, once again, whether we know it or not. So just recognizing the impact that, education, noticing the impact that, once again, race and subsequently racism and gender and class, all of these different social forces, like, influence us in every way imaginable, right? I just, in my intro class this week, we're talking about social class. And I was explaining to them how, your class influences the food that you eat, it influences the neighborhood that you live in, it influences the education that you get, it influences all of these things, and not even in a direct way where we can think, oh, if you're in a higher class, right, if you're upper middle class or upper class, you have more money to buy better food. It's deeper than that, right? If you're in a working class family, more than likely you might be living in a neighborhood that's in a food desert. So you have to travel very far away to get fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. You might only be able to go a couple of blocks and get, right, like something from a gas station or a bodega or something like that, that's not going to have as many fresh foods. That is going to impact you on so many levels. When we think about what's going on in Flint, Michigan, right, with the water, that is directly related to race and class, right, where you have mostly Black and brown people, but all of them are working class people and lower class people in these neighborhoods that are disproportionately being affected with poor water systems, and that is going to subsequently impact their health, right? And so that's another way that social forces are impacting us in all of these different ways that we can easily overlook, right? So yes, so that is all the things that sociologists look at.
Thank you. Wow. Wow. I'm so glad you're doing this. It's so needed. Now, I guess just looking at as far as a disciple,
Yeah.
the thing that I keep thinking about is, um, you know, it's very easy for us to be individualistic in the United States and just care about me.
Yep.
And that's really unbiblical in a lot of ways. And I just got to thinking, like, when you start thinking, to me, like, sociology is like the interconnectedness of relationships, whether it's on the micro between two or few people or on the macro, as you stated. So I guess I'm just thinking, like, as disciples, is it something we should, maybe we won't use the word sociology, but is there a way we should be thinking sociologically in terms of when we think about issues in the United States and how to address them? Can you speak
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, so as a sociologist, of course, I'm going to tell everybody that sociology is useful for everything, anything that you're looking to engage in and talk
Yeah.
about sociology. But on a serious note, right, like you mentioned, in the US and in a lot of westernized countries, right, but particularly in the US, we do have a very individualized way of thinking that is embedded into American culture, right? And so a lot of the times when we're presented with a social problem or a social issue, we think about it from our perspective, right? So I don't know anybody who has experienced that, or I don't know anyone who has ever dealt with that. Or even the one person that I do know that dealt with that, this is how they dealt with it, or they came to this conclusion, or they got through it this way. And so when we think about things like that, it makes it very difficult for us to empathize with other people, right? Because we're not putting ourselves in their shoes, we're just more so thinking, we're putting their problem like from our perspective, right? So we're using our lens to say whether it's valued or not, whether it is real or not. And that is not how sociologists think, right? So as a sociologist, once again, I always tell people we utilize our sociological imagination, right? Which is what that means is we utilize this way of thinking where we work to move past our personal experiences, our personal way of thinking, right? And we say, okay, let's take a step back. What are some social forces? What are some, some large scale things going on that could have impacted this situation or could be contributing to this outcome, right? So when I'm talking about this, when I'm talking about this with my intro class, a lot of what, so usually what I'll do is I'll say, okay, someone give me like just a social problem, something that you're thinking of. And they'll, usually I get homelessness, right? That's usually the one that I get as an example. And so I'll say, okay, so let's think about some structural things, some large scale things that can contribute to individuals being homeless, right? And what I do is I try to move them past thinking about stereotypes or thinking about, from their own personal lens, an individualistic lens of, well, if I work hard, then I won't be this, or if I'm not lazy, then that will not happen, right? Those are very few and far between situations. That is not what is actually contributing to homelessness within the US. So what I do is then I talk to them and I say, okay, these are actual social forces that are contributing to that. So we have jobs being outsourced, right? So then that's a large scale issue that is out of the individual's hands that contributes to that. We have large scale, once again, that's contributing to large scale unemployment. We'll have lack of affordable housing, right? Like all of these different things, decline in wages, all of that can be large scale social structure, like structural issues or structural things that are contributing to that one individual or that one group, right? Mm-hmm. So that is how sociologists work to think. So then going to your original question, or going back to that original question of how should we as Christians be utilizing this way of, or a new way of thinking, right? When it comes to I think about social issues, social justice. I think it's really what I believe that the sociological imagination is really tapping into is this idea of like radical empathy, right? So it is asking you to take yourself out of your shoes and put yourself into someone else's shoes, but not just putting yourself there. Now, I want you to think about the different things that could be contributing to this person's life, to this person's situation, whatever's going on. And then what can you do? What can you do to not change that, but to help, right? To help lessen that burden. That is what I think of when I think about the sociological imagination. So to your point, we don't have to say, oh yeah, all Christians should be sociologists, right? Although I would say that because I'm a sociologist, but that's not what we have to say, right? But what we can say is all Christians should be striving to have radical empathy, where they're not only putting themselves in someone's shoes to understand, but they're putting themselves in someone else's shoes and then saying, what can I do to lessen this burden? I think that is the way of Jesus, right? Yeah. And so we can think about that in numerous areas. We can think about that as particularly because of like all of the, I call them racial tensions, right? But because of all of the things going on around race and racism and people really striving to be anti-racist, I think that is really what that is, right? Mm-hmm. To be anti-racist is to be able to step in and say, how can I lessen this, right? Mm-hmm. How can I work to combat this? How can I work to really remove this barrier that impacts us all in a multitude of ways, right? And so so that's what I would tell Christians if they're like, how is sociology useful to me? It's really to help people, help us all tap into this radical empathy of how can we not only understand what's going on in the lives of others, understanding our own privileges, but also how to use them, right? How to use your privilege, how to come in and combat these systems and these structures that are really harmful to everyone.
It seems like it would be very hard to be a good sociologist if you don't have empathy.
I will say that is true, and I'm sure they exist. I'm sure, but I would say they probably wouldn't be good ones, right? But it is necessary for sure, and I think particularly for me, that is very necessary because I always say that if the work that I do only stays within the academy, then I didn't do enough, right? So the research that I'm doing is not just for the discipline of sociology or for academia, right? But it's really for the betterment of all people, for the betterment of Black people. Like, how can we understand how racism is really impacting Black families, and what can we do? Thank you. And what can we do to really break down this system of racism and these hierarchies that are really just really detrimental to overall well-being, right? So it's really, empathy is necessary for my work because, like I said, I'm looking to bridge it, right? So it's not just to stay in academia, but it's also how can I do this for the betterment of community as a whole, right? So
yeah. So real quick, so on that note, has there been anything you've seen, I guess, in the last year since George Floyd, or maybe even a little bit before then, like highlights where you say, man, wow, that I can see progress in terms of some, differences and betterment in society in different situations? Have you been able to see that, or what's been your experience?
that's a good question. That's a really good question. So I will say, I don't want to, I hesitate to say that I see things and I'm like, oh, this is progress, or this is right, whatever. I don't really measure it, but what I will say is I've seen people who are really looking to make changes, and that have been encouraging to me. Whether that's individual people who have expressed to me and come to me and have, kind of stated, yes, not just I want to do better, but they have shown that through their actions, right, of advocacy, allyship, right? They're really working to not only teach themselves, but also to correct those who are around them and not be comfortable, right? But like when people say things or do things that are not just contrary to, I think of Christians, not just contrary to Jesus, but also just hurtful in general, right? They stand up, and that's very necessary, and that's been encouraging. And I've also seen this across large groups of people, right? And just in popular, I guess, discourse and like things like that. Like I've seen people really working to make changes, and I think that has been really encouraging too. So things like that, I'm always like, okay, I can smile a little bit, like this is good, right? So yeah, so there have been some things I really think about, because I want to highlight them because I feel like a lot of people don't talk about them a lot, but when I think about the WNBA and just all that they have done as an organization and things like that, like I feel like those type, like they have really done a lot just to highlight the different social issues and injustices that go on, but then they do a lot behind the scenes too that a lot of people wouldn't really know about, right? Like contributing to a lot of different foundations and things like that financially, but also being able to, like, I know there are several players who like would take a year off just to be in community with people and figure out how they could help, right? And so so those types of things for sure. So like I said, I definitely have people in my networks, like people that I'm actually in community with and communicating with who are doing the work, and that's always encouraging. And then it's encouraging to see it kind of happening within a larger population as well, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like over the last year, like the set point, if you will, has gotten better, if you will. It's increased, but people in general are more aware and more concerned about their neighbor and trying to do something, which I think is awesome. So I know you and I are friends on Facebook, and you
Yeah.
post a lot of really cool stuff, which I always want to repost and share and everything. And I think definitely for Black History Month, and you may have done this before this also, you have posted a lot of individuals who have done great things. And I just wanted to know if you have any examples of Black sociologists that you can share about that have done just some amazing things that are examples to us.
Yeah. So I'll name a few Black figures, Black people who have really contributed very heavily to sociology. I think at least
W.E.B. Du
one
Bois
of
is going to
them.
be one, right?
Absolutely, that was going to be number one. I was going to say.
Okay now. I don't want to tell the university that you didn't include him.
Right. No, so he's gonna be the first one. I was gonna say there's gonna be at least one that I'm sure everyone knows, but so W.E.B. Du Bois, right? We, or at least I and a lot of other sociologists of color, really recognize him as the founding father, or at least one of the founding fathers of modern sociology, right? So he conducted the first large-scale quantitative study, so utilizing numbers and statistics and all of that in the U.S. And he is also considered to be kind of like the initiator of racial studies within the U.S. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. So very big deal. There's actually a really great.
He was at odds with Booker T, right?
They were. See, that's. I feel like that conversation is kind of the same way that people talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. It's like they weren't really at odds, right?
I just thought philosophically, because it was more like, this is a way to go about it, and that there really are things that need to change. But,
yeah, no. So they definitely had some differing views, right? But it wasn't. They weren't beefing necessarily, right? Like they it wasn't necessarily like that. But there's a really great book by Alden Morris called The Scholar Denied. And it's about W.E.B. Du Bois and really how for a large part of history, particularly within academia, he wasn't acknowledged as a founding father of sociology. He wasn't really acknowledged within academia in that way, right? And so it really just sheds light on a lot of the work that he's done and the contributions that he made, right? So it's a really great book, and it talks a lot about just a lot of things that he's done for sociology and for scholarship and really just for the U.S. as a whole, right? So another figure that I would talk about is Audrey Lord. So she's not a sociologist. She's an intellectual. She's a scholar. And a lot of what she did, she contributed heavily to the foundations of what we call intersectionality, right? So just really, she took the time to really disentangle and help us understand how different social structures or different, I guess, like identities that we have, right? So particularly she talked a lot about like how different identities impacted you and in your life, right? So she would talk a lot about how race, gender, class, all of these different parts of her would then influence, right, how she is perceived and how she moves in the world and how it impacts her life chances and all of these things. And she wouldn't always say it like that. She's a lot more eloquent. But she really shaped what we now know as intersectionality, where we in sociology examine what we call systems of inequality. So that's just, once again, like these systems that that have a hierarchy within them, right? So once again, race, gender, we can think of ability, we can think of class, all of these things, how they were, depending on where you are in those structures, will shape how you move in the world. So one of the examples I give my or students within my course is that people of the same race, a group of people of the same race can share an experience due to race, but then within that, depending on gender, depending on class, depending on, right, like ability, all of these things that will also shape how they experience the world too, right? So it won't just be race, it's going to be gender and all these other things. So that's really what Audrey Lord contributed to sociology, and whether directly or indirectly, right? And really helped us kind of shape that knowledge. And then another person, who else would I name? I would name Anna Julia Cooper, of course. And so she's a historian, but what her work did—
They're cool too. They're cool too.
Yeah, of course.
They're not sociologists, but they're cool.
Right, yeah, they're okay. But what she— no. We owe a lot to historians for sure. But a lot of what the work that she did was really just going back to this idea of intersectionality a little bit. She really centered Black women in her discussions of race and racial liberation, right? So she was born in the late 1800s. So to give you like a time frame of when she was alive, right? And I believe she passed away right before the Civil Rights Act. I believe it was like 1962 or 64 or something around there, right? So that's her time frame, really centered Black women in these conversations, because, you know, when we think about, just as an example, when we think about voting rights and things like that, right? A lot of the times, like that fight for Black people to have the right to vote, that came to Black men, right? And then Black women didn't get that right until the 1960s, right? So Black men had the right to vote in the late 1800s. Black women didn't gain that right until like the 1960s. And so even though and a lot of people, you know, don't know this, but even when the women's right to vote, right, was the women's right to vote in the 1920s or something around there, that was not allowed for Black women, right? That was relegated to white women during that time. So a lot of her work and her activism and her scholarship was just really centering Black women in the movement of liberation and equality, right? So she's kind of, hey, a lot of the times we get forgotten about in these spaces. So when we're talking about equality, let's not forget gender as well as race, right? That was a lot of what her work does.
You know, as I think about what you're sharing, it's actually sad that there's such a thing as intersectionality. You know what I mean? It should just be like, we're all the same. Why do we have, like, if you talk about like our family, yeah, I mean, there's dad, mom, whatever, but we're all equal. We're not going to have one person left out the car, or not one person, you know, coming to dinner. But it's sad that society became so, you know, divided, that there are all these different levels that we then have intersectionality. That's just sad.
Yeah, like having to understand, like you said, how all of these different social structures are influencing our life simultaneously too, right? Like all of these things are impacting us at once, for sure. Yeah. And another thing about Anna Julia Cooper I add too is that, you know, she was also a woman of faith. And so she would challenge the Christian church a lot of the times during that time. And she would challenge them when it came to— I'm going to read a quote because I was just thinking about it. And so one quote that she said, "I care not for the respectability and traditions of your theological institutions if it does not turn out better, nobler, truer men and women. If it does not add to the world's stock of valuable souls, I will have none of it." Right. And that was really how how she addressed Christians, right? She's saying, like, particularly for a lot of the white Christian churches during the time, she's saying you cannot preach about Jesus and this Jesus who was really fighting for the marginalized, fighting for the oppressed, like lifting them up, centering them in all of these ways, and then in the same way deny me, right? Deny me my rights, deny me of my personhood, deny me of that same love. So that's essentially what she's saying, right? If in your institutions of religion, you're not, in Christianity, you're not producing people who love more, who are noble, who are wiser, who are just overall better humans. She was like, then what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I think
empathic too.
right. And she's like, and I think we can really take that, and I think it's still very applicable today. Like, if we're not teaching people to be, more loving, more empathetic, just being noble and overall just good humans, right? And loving our neighbor, like you mentioned earlier, then what are we doing?
Yeah.
So
No, I hear you.
yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I definitely will be looking through those individuals and try to learn what I can.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois has a lot right there that he can teach us. So as we come to a close here, other than the Bible, what are some books that have impacted your life, number one? But I guess even if you can maybe just share about some scriptures that really inspire you when you think about, caring for each other, these kinds of things. You can maybe just share about those two points.
So a book that comes to mind right now, just because it's fresh, is I don't know if you've heard of the author Austin Channing Brown, but she wrote a book. Okay, yeah, so she wrote a book called Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. Okay. And she's a she's a woman of faith, she's a Christian, and she's really talking about and I'm paraphrasing and speaking broadly, of course, but she's really talking about how she is navigating these spaces within society as a Black woman, how, like, what that looks like, particularly when it comes to faith-based organizations and discussions of diversity and things like that. But although maybe these spaces are diverse, they're lacking inclusion. They're still feeling what she calls oppressive in a lot of ways. And so she's kind of addressing all of that. And she does it in a very beautiful, eloquent way. And so I would always recommend her book to anyone, especially Christians. I think another book is, no, I think I will, because that book is like fresh on my mind and I would feel good about recommending it. So I would leave it there. But I also, the reason I'm sure everyone's heard this book by now, but So You Want to Talk About Race by Otoma. I would also highly recommend that book as well.
She also wrote Mediocre.
I have not read that one yet. But I mean, she's an amazing author, so I'm sure it's fantastic. But once again, like, I think both of those books also give us very, not give us, but offer challenges that will allow people to think about practical ways they can engage in what we were talking about earlier, but that radical empathy, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the times it can be very easy for folks, myself included, to read about something and think, okay, I got it, I'm good now, right? Or like, I have the knowledge, so I'm done. But that's really only part of that process, right? Of engaging in social justice and social change. Like, what I usually teach people is, I'm like, okay, this process of radical empathy and accountability and all of these things, when it comes to social justice, it's, the first thing, of course, is educating yourself, But then the second thing is engaging in that radical empathy, right? And then the last part is engagement, right? So how are you engaging with what you're learning, whether that's engaging with people of, you know, marginalized spaces, or whether that's engaging with people when they do something that is right. Like how are you challenging the people around you who maybe are being, you know, racist or sexist or whatever, classist, whatever types of isms we can discuss, right? But when they're engaging in that behavior, well, how are you challenging them? How are you, you know, calling them in, helping them change, or at the very least, like correcting them, right? And in a larger scale, like how are you once again contributing to lessening that burden on others, right? So you know, just really encouraging folks as they're reading and getting this knowledge, just not letting that be the end, right? Not letting that be the end point. And then as far as scriptures go, you know, I was gonna mention this earlier, but I forgot. But as a sociologist, and this isn't a scripture necessarily talking about love, but I think it was a scripture that really impacted me when I first read it, when I was making the decision to follow Jesus, and I think about it very often. But so, right, like not only do this is an example of this, but not only do social structures and all of that impact our lived experiences, but they impact how we see things, right? And how we, and even how we see the scriptures, right? So not that the scriptures are changing, the scriptures are forever, they are the same, they do not change, but how we perceive things, right? Our race and our gender and all these things do influence how we read the scriptures. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I remember when I read John 4, right? The woman at the well.
Yeah.
And we hear that a lot. And I remember when I read that scripture and I was like, oh my gosh, like Jesus saw this woman who was like outcast in society, who people saw her as, you know, less than everyone else, right? She was unworthy of the spaces that she was in. She was having to go, you know, get water at this particular time so she could avoid people, all of this. And Jesus saw her, right? He saw her, a woman who I saw at the time when reading that, and still do, as someone who was oppressed in a lot of different ways. And he lifted her up, right? He lifted her up, and not only did he give her hope, and he saw her and he loved her, but he then used her, right? Or she was then used by God to go and share about him and convert a whole town, just about, right? Like to, you know, to be able to tell this whole town about who Jesus is. Like that is what I saw when I read that story. And I remember, or read that scripture rather, and when I remember I would hear people talk about that scripture, and that was not how other people were reading it, right? Like as I continue in my Christianity, I remember hearing peers, and not saying it's right or wrong, but I think this is just a way of us to understand how you know, I think you've posted about the book before, but like the scriptures through Western eyes or something.
Yeah,
to that.
I was actually just thinking about that. Yeah.
Right. And so I would hear other people talk about her, and they would talk about like promiscuity, right? When they would read through John 4, they would talk about promiscuity. They would talk about all of these different things. Even I would hear some people talk about or make reference to maybe Jesus kind of being shady towards her, right? Or being right, like when he would mention, you know, you have several husbands, the man you're with is not your husband, right? But I never read it in that way. I always read it as him saying it very gently, and being like, hey, you know, I know that you've had multiple husbands, and I just want you to know I see you. That's how I always read that. And I think that goes to speak to the way that the way that we live, once again, these social structures, these things that kind of shape how we function in society, they really shape us in every way, whether we know it or not, right? And I would be remiss to think that because of my experiences as a Black woman in the United States, I can't deny that that probably shaped how I read that scripture, right? As someone who has felt racism or sexism in different ways and has felt oppressed in different ways, for me to then read and see how Jesus lifted up someone who was being oppressed, like, yeah, you know, so that's, so when I think about just our conversation, I wanted to share that because that was one of the first scriptures I read where I was like, oh, like, no, Jesus sees me, right? And I think we can go back and look at scriptures like that, where Jesus interacts with folks, and we can say, oh no, Jesus sees us, right? He sees past the, or not even sees past, but he sees us and he loves us, right? And he sees those who society puts on the margins and he lifts them up. And and not that he loves someone more than anyone else, but like he loves everyone, right? And I think that's what really stands out to me when I read those interactions with Jesus. And yeah, I just wanted to share that. And I think another scripture that I think about often is I was gonna say is John 16. And I'm gonna read it because I don't want to mess it up. But John 16:33. And it says, I have told you these things, so in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And I think about that scripture very often, not in the sense of unity necessarily, although I think that is also part of what that scripture means. I think that's what Jesus does, right? Is Jesus brings unity. But when I read that scripture, I think about hope, right? And so a large part of, you know, fighting for social justice, fighting for change, fighting for equality, all of these things that I know you tend to fight for, I'm fighting for a lot, like a lot of us as Christians, I know we want that, right? Equality and all of these things. And so when we do that, we have to have imagination.
Yep. Wow.
We have to have hope. We have to have these things, right? And so if we don't have imagination, how can we imagine a world, or how can we fight for a world where everyone's treated equally? Because we haven't seen it, right? How can we fight for a world where we're all loved and we're all working together, we're all unified? Because we have not seen it, right? But Jesus says that in me you can have hope and you can have peace. And that's, when I read that scripture, that is what I'm reminded of, is that, you know, although I haven't seen it, I can keep fighting for it, right? I can keep praying for it. I can keep working for it because I put my hope and my peace in Jesus, so that I can keep forward and I can keep doing the work that's necessary. So
thank you.
So yeah, just wanted to share those two things. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I love John too. That's an awesome book right there. Yeah, so how can we find more about you? People that want to learn more about, I know you have written have published 2 papers. You do different conferences, if you will. So how can people find more about you, the different things you're working on and so forth?
Yeah, so you can always find me and connect with me on Instagram if you have one of those. My Instagram name is @Mia Janae, so MIA_JAHNA. And I also have a website where I keep everything up to date, things that I'm doing, different community engagements. So that's MIA-Brantley, B as in boy, RANTLEY.com. So Mia-Brantley.com.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was checking out your website earlier today. Got some great stuff on there. Very, very inspiring.
Oh,
okay. For those of you that enjoy the episode, definitely please click like, consider subscribing, and share this with your friends. Thanks again.